All right, everybody, and we are back. Today, going down to the Bayou to discuss none other than the New Orleans Saints. And I have very much been looking forward to do this video because I really have seen a lot of hype around the Saints this offseason. Not necessarily as a Super Bowl contender per se, but definitely seems to be the fan favorite to win the NFC South. And that's a notion that I haven't necessarily agreed with, so I've been looking forward to just doing a deep dive on their roster. So, that being said, like we have with pretty much every other team at this point, we'll give a little bit of background on New Orleans. And funny enough, they are, of course, coming off of the Drew Brees and Sean Payton era, but I knew they didn't have much success before that, but then I really looked at this, and prior to 2006, they only have one playoff victory, that coming over the greatest show on turf, St. Louis Rams, after the 2000 NFL season. But putting that aside, looking at their more recent success, they've had 7 wins every single season since 2005, and that has continued even without Drew Brees and Sean Payton last season. Drew Brees departing after the 2020 season, Sean Payton following the 2021 season. And despite that fact, though, since Drew Brees did retire in 2020, they have missed the postseason, the last 2 seasons. So, while New Orleans hasn't necessarily fallen off a cliff, they have taken a step back, and that's to be expected. So, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive here on the 2022 Saints. Now, the 2022 Saints, as we know, they finished with a 7-10 record. Head coach Dennis Allen with his first season on the sidelines, and really it's not a bad campaign at all. The Saints end up with a top 10 defense last season, and this defense absolutely excelled against the pass. They were second in terms of pass yards allowed, third in terms of passing touchdowns allowed, although they didn't necessarily generate interceptions. But looking at the defense as a whole, fifth in terms of yards allowed and ninth in terms of points allowed. So absolutely a top 10 unit there. But looking at the offense, not a terrible unit, but definitely a below average unit. They're 22nd in points for and 19th in terms of total yards gained. And we can look down here at the Saints 2022 schedule to see how things really shook out for them. And really, they did play in perhaps the weakest division in the National Football League last year in the NFC South, and despite that fact, they still failed to make the playoffs, and they still failed to even have a winning record in this division. They go 2-4 against the division last season, with the 2 wins both being over the Atlanta Falcons. First in week 1, they win by 1 point against Atlanta, and then they also win in week 15 against Atlanta, both by 1 score. So they beat Atlanta by 1 point in week 1 and then by just 3 points in week 15. Meanwhile, they get swept by both the Carolina Panthers and the Tampa Bay Bucks. And yes, I know the Tampa Bay Bucks had Tom Brady last season, but part of the reason why I still like Tampa Bay in the NFC South this season is because I think Tampa Bay's offense really wasn't that impressive last season. And yes, don't get me wrong, going from Tom Brady to Baker Mayfield will absolutely be a step in the wrong direction, but I don't think it'll be as big of a step as people might think, at least from 2022. The Bucks defense was solid, but anyway, we'll discuss that when we get to Tampa Bay's video. That's another one I'm really looking forward to doing. But anyways, we can move along here. Did also want to note with the Saints schedule, yes, they finished with a 7-10 record, but if you look closely here, heading into their Week 14 bye, they ended with a 4-9 record, and then just won 3 games coming out of the bye here to sort of just make the record a little bit more salvageable. Those 3 wins being over the Atlanta Falcons, Cleveland Browns, and Philadelphia Eagles, although when the Eagles, in that Eagles game, it was with Gardner Minshew as the quarterback. So 2 wins over non-playoff teams, and then a win over a playoff team that already had postseason seeding largely locked up and starting a backup quarterback. Now, moving along to the more individual statistics, definitely worth noting with this 2022 Saints roster, Jameis Winston was projected to be the starter, although he did go down to injury relatively early on, although that may not have been the worst thing in the world for the Saints because Jameis Winston had a pretty poor showing when he was in with a 1-2 record, 858 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions in 3 starts. Meanwhile, Andy Dalton, the Ginger himself, fills in his 12th season. Really made a nice career for himself, Andy Dalton. He was a very serviceable starter for the Cincinnati Bengals for many, many years prior to Joe Burrow, and since the Bengals moved on from Andy Dalton in favor of Joe Burrow, he's bounced around to a few teams now and been a solid backup, and as we'll see in a second, he moves on to a new team where I think he will be a tremendous backup this season. But starting 14 games for the Saints last year, he goes a 6-8 record with 18 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, and just shy of 3,000 yards. So for a 35-year-old backup quarterback, I mean, that's more than serviceable. Obviously not ideal, but he's your backup. You really can't ask for too much more than that. Now looking at the rushing and receiving statistics, start with Alvin Kamara, which funny enough, I did a little research on Alvin Kamara prior to this video, and Alvin Kamara has actually never rushed for 1,000 yards, much to my surprise. Very consistently getting close to that figure, but has never crossed the 1,000 yard threshold on the ground. Um, just thought that was interesting, but Alvin Kamara does miss a few games last year as well. He ends up with 897 rushing yards, just 2 touchdowns, but also gives you another 490 through the air and another 2 touchdowns. So very nearly 1,400 all-purpose yards. And Alvin Kamara is still a solid player, but definitely the last couple seasons has been very slightly regressing. You can start to see that as he creeps closer to age 30, gets closer to, I believe he is actually over 1,000 carries now. Definitely starting to see some wear and tear on Alvin Kamara. But it seems the Saints are aware of that, as we'll see when we get to their offseason. Looking at the receiver position, they bring in Chris Olave in the first round in last year's draft, and he quickly emerges as the #1 receiver here. Eclipses the 1,000-yard mark in just his first year with 4 touchdowns. And meanwhile, former #1 receiver Michael Thomas really struggling to see the field here. Just 3 games due to yet another injury-shortened season. Just 171 yards with 3 touchdowns. But 3 touchdowns in 3 games, that's pretty solid. I'll give him that. So really, since 2019, Michael Thomas hasn't seen the field consistently. And it's a shame because over his first 4 seasons, he was consistently getting better and better every season, to the point where in the 2019 season, you very easily could have made the case that Michael Thomas was the best receiver in the National Football League. But really seems like he's fallen off a cliff. So perhaps this season, with Chris Olave now established as the #1, take some of the pressure off of him. If he's able to just stay on the field and be productive, stay healthy, he could have a nice season. But quickly go over the defense here. Definitely the standouts are Cam Jordan, defensive edge rusher here at age 33, longtime veteran for the New Orleans Saints, and Demario Davis, linebacker, also a veteran at age 33. They each get 6.5 sacks at least. Cam Jordan actually gets 8.5. Cam Jordan also has 2 forced fumbles, while Demario Davis has a fumble recovery and an interception. And these are actually the only two players to make the Pro Bowl for the 2022 New Orleans Saints. And we'll give a shout out to some of the other guys on this defense: Caden Ellis, Carl Granderson, David Onyemata, Kentavious Street, Tyrann Mathieu, of course, the Honey Badger. All had solid seasons here, and this, like I said, this Saints defense was a top 10 unit last year, so definitely not surprising that some of their better players are from this defensive unit. But New Orleans, it wasn't enough for them. They want to try to get into the playoffs, especially now that Tom Brady has retired from the Tampa Bay Bucks. This NFC South is, I'd say, the most wide open division in the National Football League right now. There's definitely some divisions that might be more competitive, like the AFC East, the AFC North, but that's more so because all of those teams are really, really good. And not saying that the teams in the NFC South are garbage by any means, but you have a team like Carolina that's starting to turn things around. You have a team like Atlanta that's trying to build something up. Tampa Bay kind of trying to, and honestly, I'd lump New Orleans in there too. Tampa Bay and New Orleans kind of trying to keep together a core of very competitive teams from the late 2010s, early 2020s, without that franchise quarterback that they had in Drew Brees and Tom Brady. So definitely a vulnerable division, and one where any of the four teams I think could emerge victorious. So let's take a look now at what the Saints did to try to put themselves over that hump to really establish themselves as the king of the South. Now, looking at the Saints 2023 off-season, they do have quite a few notable departures, mostly on defense, so we'll start there. And as we discussed in the Minnesota video very recently, they lose defensive tackle Marcus Davenport to the Vikings at 27 in the middle of his prime. They also lose defensive tackle Shy Tuttle to the Carolina Panthers. Additionally, they lose David Onyemata, another defensive tackle, to the Atlanta Falcons. They lose linebacker Caden Ellis to the Atlanta Falcons as well. And then finally, Andy Dalton moving on to the Carolina Panthers. So I think I mentioned this during the Atlanta and Carolina videos as well, but these NFC South teams really seem to like just exchanging their players with each other. It's quite funny just to pick up on that, but it seems like with the Saints' departures, most of them are on the defensive line, so they'll absolutely have some voids to fill there. And Andy Dalton did start the majority of their games at quarterback last season, so that leaves a huge gap there as well. Looking at the Saints' additions now, and absolutely the largest addition they made was at the quarterback position. Very rare that you see proven NFL starting quarterbacks with an above average even track record. Really, it's rare that any starting NFL quarterbacks who are less than just terrible end up hitting the free agent market on the open market and are free to sign with another team. They almost always get hit with the franchise tag, or they get extended and then eventually traded. So definitely interesting to see a quarterback like Derek Carr hit the open market and really see what he's worth. And good Lord, does Derek Carr get the bag from the New Orleans Saints. Gets a 4-year deal right around $40 million, so I'm sure Derek Carr is absolutely loving that. And like I mentioned in the Raiders video, really was surprised that the Raiders turned the page on Derek Carr as quickly as they did. He really was somebody who wore his heart on his sleeve for that organization. And while, yeah, he's not the best quarterback in the league, I would say he's definitely an above average quarterback. And he got paid like a great quarterback, so props to Derek Carr, but I think the Saints are definitely in good hands here. And I know this acquisition was a huge reason why many people do believe the New Orleans Saints are the best team in the NFC South, simply because they have the best quarterback now. Although I do believe by the end of the season, it could end up being Bryce Young. So stay tuned on that. I think Derek Carr is at worst the second best quarterback, though, in the NFC South. Certainly better than Desmond Ridder and Baker Mayfield by my estimations. So looking at some of the other additions here, because that's definitely the most notable one. They have a few other key ones, though. They do add a defensive tackle in Kalen Saunders from the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. He plays 34% of snaps for the Chiefs last year, and very well may be a starter for the New Orleans Saints this season. Definitely with all the bodies they lost on that defensive line, they're going to need somebody to step up. Could very well be Kalen Saunders. They also bring in defensive tackle Nathan Shepard from the New York Jets. Almost called them the New Jersey Jets. They do play in New Jersey, but he played 36% of snaps for them last season. He's at age 30, and again, just because of the sheer quantity of players they lost on that defensive line, he very well may be a starter immediately as well. Then the Saints bring in a key playmaker on offense, Jamal Williams, originally of the Green Bay Packers, more recently of the Detroit Lions. Jamal Williams had an absolutely phenomenal season for the Detroit Lions last year. Entering last year's campaign, the expectation was that DeAndre Swift was going to be the go-to man in the backfield for the Detroit Lions, but due to a combination of Swift just getting banged up and underachieving a little bit, Jamal Williams really ran away with that job and established himself as the go-to back in that Detroit backfield. So especially now, as we'll see in a second, Alvin Kamara is suspended for the first 3 games of the 2023 season. Jamal Williams has a real chance here to seize the Saints' running back role. I don't know if he will be the starting running back once Alvin Kamara comes back, but Could definitely be a nice thunder and lightning kind of duo, much like the Saints had with Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara. Maybe Alvin Kamara could just be more of the pass-catching running back, and Jamal Williams can do more of the actual rushing, which was definitely the dynamic they had in Detroit between Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift being more of a pass-catching back. Then finally, I will mention coming over from the Las Vegas Raiders alongside Derek Carr, tight end Foster Moreau. Now, Foster Moreau wasn't the Raiders' starting tight end last season, although he did end up playing 67% of snaps, largely attributed to Darren Waller being sidelined with injury. And while he may not be the Saints' starting tight end right away this season, he's certainly going to be involved in the offense in a big way. Saints could definitely run some two tight end sets with him and their starting tight end, who we'll see in a second, but I do believe Foster Moreau will definitely help ease Derek Carr into this offense. Always good to have a familiar face. So, with that being said, let's take a look at this 2023 Saints draft. And this is really this 29th overall selection that the Saints end up with comes from so many different teams. It's not even funny. So, I mean, actually, it's hilarious. I will say that. But it starts out originally as the San Francisco 49ers draft pick, and it gets traded at the 2021 draft to the Miami Dolphins as part of the trade for the 49ers to move up to the number 3 overall selection to select Trey Lance. As we know, Trey Lance now getting traded for a 4th round pick to the Dallas Cowboys. Not really a great return on their investment there, but point aside, then the Miami Dolphins take the 29th overall pick and trade it to the Denver Broncos at the trade deadline last season in exchange for Bradley Chubb. And then at during the offseason this year, Denver takes the pick that they acquired at the deadline for Bradley Chubb, and they trade it to the New Orleans Saints in exchange for the bounty man himself, Sean Payton. End up getting him in exchange for that Saints first round pick, or I'm sorry, that San Francisco first round pick, among some other draft picks that we'll see later on. But when all is said and done, this San Francisco 49ers first round pick does end up in the hands of the New Orleans Saints. And why the Saints don't have their first round pick, which would have been 10th overall, they traded that to the Philadelphia Eagles so that they could have these 2 first round selections in 2022 to select Chris Olave and Trevor Penning. But when all said and done with the 29th overall selection, the New Orleans Saints select Bryan Bresee, defensive tackle out of Clemson. So definitely adding some more depth to that defensive line that they will sorely need. And in the second round, they doubled down on it, taking an edge rusher in Isaiah Foskey out of Notre Dame. And the only other notable player I'll mention here is running back Kendre Miller in the 3rd round out of TCU. And only say it's notable because while he probably will be the number 3 running back for most of the season, for those first 3 weeks while Alvin Kamara is suspended, definitely going to be a good opportunity for him to really showcase his talents, much like Jamal Williams. He will be the number 2 running back alongside Jamal Williams for those first 3 weeks. And rounding out here, they do have 4 more additional selections, but these are more fringe players for the team. I mean, Nick Saldiveri, the offensive lineman, he should certainly make the team. I imagine all these guys will make the team, but definitely going to be more reserves. Then they take a flyer on more developmental quarterback and Jake Hayner out of Fresno State, defensive back Jordan Howden out of Minnesota, and finally wide receiver A.T. Perry from Wake Forest. So with all that being said, really not a bad offseason for the Saints. Lost a lot of talent on the defensive line, but they get their franchise quarterback. They add another playmaker in Jamal Williams, even another one in the draft with Kendre Miller, and definitely do a good job of trying to fill the voids on that defensive line. So let's see now how they put it all together here with this depth chart. What does Dan Campbell have in store for, I'm sorry, Dennis Allen, not Dan Campbell, have in store for us this season? Dan Campbell with Detroit. So we'll start out with the quarterback position here, and they have Derek Carr obviously as their man now, with Jameis Winston as the veteran backup, with Jake Hayner, the rookie, as the developmental 3rd stringer. Definitely a clear pecking order here, a lot more clean than what they had last season, the last couple seasons honestly, since Drew Brees departed. Derek Carr is certainly not Drew Brees, but definitely the closest thing they've had to a solid starting quarterback since his departure. Now we'll look at the running back spot, and as I mentioned, Alvin Kamara suspended for the first 3 games, so this is going to be a tandem of Jamal Williams and Kendre Miller, and Alvin Kamara, even once he returns, likely takes this top spot and just scoots these guys down one peg, so they'll have a nice three-headed committee here to really establish a ground game. And they'll be playing behind an offensive line which, I mean, I really won't say that this is even an average league unit right now. They've definitely invested a lot of early draft picks into this offensive line, but a lot of these guys really just haven't been landing. Like Trevor Penning, the rookie from last year, certainly time. He only played 1 season in the National Football League so far, but they're going to need more out of him if they want this offensive line to be successful. He hasn't really lived up to the hype so far. Then they have Andrews Pete at left guard, Eric McCoy at center, Cesar Ruiz at right guard, and Ryan Ramczyk at right tackle. All players selected in the first or second round. Actually, the only player not selected in the first round was Eric McCoy, selected in the second round in 2019. Then we can look at some of the reserves here as well, and really not a lot jumping out here. They do have the rookie Nick Saldiveri as potential backup for the interior of the offensive line. They have Max Garcia and James Hurst who could potentially fill in, but really not an established tackle on the outside that could potentially fill in, and that's not good considering it doesn't seem like they're entirely satisfied with what Trevor Penning has been giving them so far. So when all's said and done, if we wanted to compare this to some of the offensive lines we've discussed already, I would say this is probably, honestly, Buffalo would probably be a pretty good comp for this offensive line. Maybe even a team like Houston or Jacksonville. Like, it's not bad. If you have talent around them on this offense, it could certainly be one that's passable. But I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that this is one of the better units in the National Football League. I don't even know if this is an average unit in the National Football League right now. But not one of the worst. Definitely could be worse than this unit. Looking at the tight end position now, Jawan Johnson figures to be their starter, although they do have Foster Moreau, as we mentioned in the offseason additions. And then, of course, have to mention Taysom Hill, the weapon himself, could play quarterback, could play tight end, could be a kick returner. Really, whatever they need him to do, he's there for him. So don't be surprised if you see Taysom Hill catching some passes. Don't be surprised if you see Taysom Hill throwing some passes. He could just run a quarterback draw too. Really, anything you can do on the field, Taysom Hill is capable of. Then they also bring back Jimmy Graham, which is definitely an interesting move, considering really nobody that Jimmy Graham played with from his first stint in New Orleans is still here. Suppose Cameron Jordan was a teammate of his, but I think that's really about it. Jimmy Graham departed the New Orleans Saints after, I believe, the 2014 season. It's either 2013 or 2014, so he's been gone for a long time now. And honestly, kind of surprised that Jimmy Graham's still kicking around in the league. He was an absolutely phenomenal tight end when he played for the New Orleans Saints originally, right up there with Rob Gronkowski as the best tight end in the league, but in more recent days he has been regressing as Father Time does to you. He's undefeated, so Jimmy Graham, good for him, still hanging around in the league, but I would be surprised if he plays beyond this season for the New Orleans Saints or really any team. Um, Now in his 14th season, definitely a good run for a tight end. Then finally on offense, we'll look at the wide receiver position, and the top 2 guys are pretty well established here, Michael Thomas and Chris Olave, but pretty wide open after that. They do have Rashid Shaheed at the slot position and Traquan Smith backing him up. Traquan Smith definitely was a productive player for them last season. And they have A.T. Perry, the rookie from the 6th round, so maybe he's going to get some noticeable reps this year, maybe even more than anticipated for a 6th round pick, but definitely a wide open competition going on here between pretty much all of these players, and I would anticipate guys like Traquan Smith, A.T. Perry, Rashid Shaheed emerge victorious here, but we'll see how many receivers the Saints carry on their roster when all is said and done. So with that being said, this Saints offense as a whole, I don't know. It's definitely not a bad unit, but I'm not going to say it strikes a ton of fear into me. I see why people would think this offense is capable of winning the NFC South. We haven't looked at the defense yet, though. But just speaking in terms of Derek Carr specifically, because I know he's definitely the big factor in why people are confident in this offense taking a leap this year, because we do have to recall this was a subpar offense last season. I just think, though, that Derek Carr last year had Devontae Adams brought in, had Josh Jacobs behind him with 2,000 all-purpose yards. Darren Waller, granted he was injured at tight end, same with Hunter Renfrow at receiver, also injured, but did have Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs firing on all cylinders last season, and Derek Carr's statistics really didn't budge from what we've become accustomed to seeing from him, whereas even by the end of the season, he ended up getting benched. Granted, I don't think that benching was justified, but it does make me wonder, though, looking at the Saints offense, I don't see a Devontae Adams here. I don't see a Josh Jacobs here. There are some great players. I like Chris Olave. I like Jamal Williams. I like Alvin Kamara even in 2023. But really not sure about how I feel about how Derek Carr is going to do this season, because I don't even believe this offensive line is as good as the one he played behind with the Raiders. So he's playing behind a worse offensive line, probably a worse receiving core, because outside of Chris Olave, you're really rolling the dice on Michael Thomas bouncing back, because they really don't have much beyond that. I do like what they have in the backfield, but even at tight end, Jawan Johnson is not Darren Waller, and Foster Moreau is, I mean, you brought him directly from the Raiders, so that's a one-to-one comparison. I just don't know if the talent around him is as good. And I understand they're not playing in the AFC West. They're playing in the NFC South. It's definitely going to be a different, whole different kind of ball they're playing this year in terms of what the expectations are. But the Raiders finished last season with a very subpar record, finished worse than the Saints, ended up missing the playoffs. I don't know. Let's take a look at the defense, and then we can really take a look at the schedule and see how we feel. So looking at this defense, they do have Cameron Jordan returning to the fold in his 13th season, with the two new acquisitions, Nathan Shepard and Kalen Saunders, starting on the interior, with a competition going on this other outside position between Carl Granderson, Isaiah Foskey, and Payton Turner. So these were all, well, Carl Granderson wasn't drafted early, but Isaiah Foskey was their second round selection this year. Payton Turner, their first round selection from 2 seasons ago. And while they would like to give this job to Payton Turner because of the first round pick status, he just hasn't been living up to expectations, so it's hard for them to justify handing this job to Payton Turner. And Isaiah Foskey could certainly earn this job by the end of the season. I imagine both of these players will be rotating in. Honestly, even for Cam Jordan, as he is in his 13th season. But at the moment, it does seem Carl Granderson has the inside track for this job and has really stood out in training camp from the other two competitors. Then we do also have to mention Bryan Bresee as a reserve on this interior of the defensive line. But beyond that, really not too much doing here. I have to say this is probably, for a team that runs a 4-3, this is probably one of the weaker defensive lines in the National Football League right now. Which is quite a shame, because New Orleans, I feel, over the last few seasons, did have one of the more underrated defensive lines in the NFL, and they always seem to come up big when you least expected it. And whenever New Orleans needed a big win or just a big stand from their defense, like that defensive line was always rock solid and rose to the occasion. But we'll see how this new look line does this season. I definitely have to say it's one of the weaker ones as of right now, but if the young players like Bryan Bresee and Isaiah Foskey can really establish themselves, this unit could be better. But even then, you kind of need these guys to step up, because the one guy you can depend on, Cameron Jordan, he's in his 13th season. He's not going to be here forever. So looking at the linebacker position now, and this team does run a 4-3, so not a ton of investment here, but the starters are penciled in as Pete Werner, Demario Davis, and Zach Bowen. Like this group, like this starting three, Demario Davis, definitely the standout player here. Pete Warner and Zach Bond, both on their rookie deals, so at the very least, they can progress, they can develop and get better, and you're not paying them a ton of money, so not the worst thing in the world. And then really not too much in terms of reserves. They do have Jalen Smith, who was originally of the Dallas Cowboys, more recently of the New York Giants. Definitely high potential there, as we know, but hasn't really realized it at the NFL level. And finally, looking at this secondary, and this secondary I would say is about an average unit across the National Football League, and that is largely attributed to having Marshawn Lattimore and Tyrann Mathieu. Definitely a solid 1-2 punch there, despite the fact that Tyrann Mathieu is a free safety. But Marshawn Lattimore as your lockdown corner, we know what he's going to do. Any team they're going up against, he's going to be able to take out their number one weapon. So they face off against the Tampa Bay Bucks twice a year. You could put him on Mike Evans or Chris Godwin, whichever one you prefer, whichever one's given them more trouble. Then when they go up against the Carolina Panthers, Carolina really doesn't have a lot of tremendous receivers right now. So if it's a guy like Adam Thielen, I like that matchup for the Saints. And if they're going up against Atlanta, well, there's the guy you put on Drake London. Then you still have Tyrann Mathieu at the free safety position, Marcus May at strong safety, which isn't as impressive. They do have Jordan Howden from the 5th round this year as a potential fill-in for him. Then there is a competition at this second cornerback position between Alontae Taylor and Paulson Adebo, if I can talk. So both of these guys are day 2 selections, both no longer rookies. Alontae Taylor was a 2nd-round pick in 2022. Paulson Adebo was a 3rd-round selection in 2021. So they're both young, both hungry for this job. But as of right now, it seems that Alontae Taylor does have the inside edge by just a smidge. But this is definitely the most competitive battle going on at training camp right now. And quite possible that if Alontae Taylor does emerge victorious, one, Paulson Adebo could slide in as a platoon piece for them at this number 2 corner spot, but they could also potentially move him down to the nickel spot here, where they currently have Bradley Roby penciled in. So with that being said, this New Orleans defense I feel is going to take a slight step back from last season, although I do still like what I see here. If the young players can really step it up by the end of the season, this could be an impressive unit, but looking at this team as a whole, I would say there really isn't one Achilles heel that jumps out at me. I don't love the defensive line, but I like it more than I thought I would going into this video. Same with the offensive line. I wasn't expecting to be overly impressed with it, but I think it can be serviceable for them. Definitely, I'd say their biggest opportunities are in the trenches on either side. I like what they have in terms of Chris Olave and Michael Thomas at the top of the receiving depth chart, but really not a lot beyond that. And then in the secondary, I do like their high-end talent here. Tyrann Mathieu, Marshawn Lattimore, even the 2 young guys battling out for the second corner spot, but not really a lot beyond that. So, let's see how New Orleans can put this all together. Looking at New Orleans' schedule, I have them finishing 5-12, which definitely might be a little bit unfair to New Orleans, but let's go down the line here. Tennessee comes in against the Saints in week 1, and New Orleans did struggle against the run last year, so I don't love that matchup against Derek Henry with a new look defensive line in the first week. I think it's just going to be a little bit too much for the Saints, and the Titans will emerge with the victory here. Week 2 against Carolina. This is tough. This is a Monday night game, and honestly, I'm excited for this one because Carolina, this is Bryce Young's second start. It is, I believe, his first start at home. I'd have to double check that, but I don't know. I like the matchup of Chris Olave going up against that Carolina secondary. Like I said in the Carolina video, Carolina's secondary does have some aspects I like to it, but Chris Olave is a great player. But then again, like Carolina's secondary could negate the rest of that Saints receiving core. Then in the trenches, I like the matchup of Carolina's offensive line against the Saints defensive line for sure. And Likewise, I like the matchup of Carolina's defensive line against the Saints' offensive line. So this one really is a bit of a coin flip for me. If you wanted to give this one to the Saints, I wouldn't hold it against you, but I sided with the home team here. Carolina did beat the Saints twice last season. Carolina has upgraded their quarterback position as well, so I give this one to Carolina. Week 3 against Green Bay, do give this one to the Saints. I think Jordan Love's still going to be figuring things out in Week 3, but I like what the Saints have here. I do. In Week 4 against Tampa Bay, their second divisional matchup, first against the Bucks. I think Tampa Bay, their defense is just going to be too much for the Saints offense. Um, Granted, Tampa Bay's defensive line, I don't think is going to be too much of a challenge for the Saints offensive line, but I do like the talent that the Bucks have in the secondary still. Obviously, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin at receiver on offense for them. Really, besides the quarterback position, I don't think there's one spot where the Bucks have really downgraded significantly from last year. I do like the matchup of Tampa Bay's offensive line against the Saints' defensive line. So that being said, I give this one to Tampa Bay. Now, looking at Week 5, again, with the Saints and the Patriots, we just discussed New England, so this one's fresh. Like the matchup for the Patriots on both sides of the trenches here as well. And while Mac Jones isn't necessarily a great quarterback, we saw that roster. The Patriots are another team that has a very well-rounded roster. So again, there's a lot of these games of the Saints I feel like could really go either way. Same with this next one against the Texans. I'm very encouraged about the Texans this season too. I think they'll impress, but I don't think the Saints are going to be running away with these matchups. It's not the most difficult schedule, but it's definitely not a cakewalk. No game in the National Football League is a cakewalk, especially for the Saints. I don't think the Saints have just a runaway roster where they're going to be capable of steamrolling these teams. Love to be proven wrong, but Week 7 on a short week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars are a good team. They have their sights firmly set on the playoffs. I like Jacksonville here. Then Week 8 against the Colts. Could definitely give this one to the Saints, but Anthony Richardson might be running all over the field against these guys. It's tough to say, so I do like the matchup of the Colts offensive line against the Saints defensive line here as well. I'm, as we mentioned in that video, I'm a fan of Indy's offensive line. But who knows? The Colts have a very weak secondary, so maybe Chris Olave could have a big day against the Colts here. Week 9 against the Bears, honestly a pretty similar deal to the Colts matchup, but Saints are at home this time. The Bears don't have as good of an offensive line, so the Saints defense should be able to generate a little bit more pressure on Justin Fields, force him to make some bad decisions. Give this one to the Saints. Week 10 against Minnesota. Not really too much debate here from me. Give this one to Minnesota. Then they get their bye week. Coming out of the bye week, they play Atlanta. And honestly, these next two matchups are two teams with pretty good offensive lines, the Falcons and the Lions. And yes, I know Desmond Ridder is the quarterback for the Falcons, but that being said, I do think this is going to be a close game. Any divisional game is going to be. So give the nod to the Falcons and the Lions in these two games, but Saints get their payback against the Panthers here. Then they match up with the Giants, or I do like that matchup for the New Orleans Saints. Not huge on the Giants' talent at the skill positions, not huge on the Giants' offensive line. This should be a matchup that's favorable for the Saints' defense. Then they play the Rams on a short week here, and this is honestly one the Saints could win here too. Wouldn't be surprised in the slightest, especially if the Rams are down and out by this point and the Saints need to win this matchup. But then week 17, I give them their payback over the Bucks before. Week 18, I gave the Falcons the victory over the Saints, but honestly, in hindsight, I could see a few of these games going a different way, and that could be all it takes for the Saints to win. So hypothetically, let's say they split with the Falcons. Let's give them this win over the Rams, and then even we give them this win over the Colts. Like that alone ties them with Tampa Bay at 8 and 9. And I feel that's a much more fair assessment of the New Orleans Saints for the 2023 season. But definitely still up in the air. Definitely still like Tampa Bay in this division, but pleasantly surprised with the Saints, but then again, when we reviewed the Panthers and the Falcons, I was pleasantly surprised with those teams as well. So this NFC South could really go in any direction here. Feel very confident in saying that much at the very least. So, moving on to, we'll briefly look at the Saints' cap outlook and draft picks before we wrap this up. The Saints are a team that's pressed right up against the cap for the next 3 seasons, it would seem, so something is going to have to give here. They have Derek Carr's contract structured where the cap hits low this season, but it quickly balloons up to $35 million, followed by $45 and $55 million respectively. And looking at this 2026 season, entirely possible that they restructure this again by this point, or can just cut bait from Derek Carr if he doesn't live up to expectations. Likewise with Alvin Kamara, just an $8 million cap figure this season, but balloons to 18 next year and 29 the year after that. Definitely not going to be in a scenario where Alvin Kamara is 29 million against the cap come 2025. So they're either going to restructure this deal as well, or will cut bait with Alvin Kamara after next season, because they do have Jamal Williams on a very team-friendly deal for 3 years here, and Kendre Miller for 4 seasons at a reasonable cap hit. So, man, Alvin Kamara, one of the few running backs that did get his bag, and he might not even be seeing all of it. So, very unfortunate for him. Hope for his sake he could have a nice bounce-back season. Then looking at wide receiver, Michael Thomas, the only real notable cap hit here, but again, if he doesn't have a bounce-back season, he could be on his way out the door as well. They do have Chris Olave on a very favorable rookie deal for at least the next 3 years, potentially even 4, but beyond that, pretty much a blank slate at wide receiver. Tight end, they have really nothing invested here majorly. They have Taysom Hill on a big money deal, it would seem, but I don't know. Taysom Hill, definitely think the Saints staff are a big fan of him, and their management is as well, but $15 million a year, that seems like a lot for Taysom Hill. That's money that would give you pretty much any running back you want in the National Football League. You could trade for Jonathan Taylor and sign him for this much money, and I would definitely like that move over keeping Taysom Hill in the fold, but I don't know. Definitely seems that the Saints are enamored with Taysom Hill. Then looking at the offensive line, really not much of an investment here. Cesar Ruiz is in the contract year, so as is Andrus Peat actually, and James Hurst. So potentially a lot of shuffling going around on the offensive line beyond this season. Definitely worth keeping an eye on that. They do have Ryan Ramczyk signed for the big money deal on the offensive line, along with Eric McCoy. On the defensive line, Cam Jordan signed for the next 3 seasons. Be interested to see if he plays that out, considering he's already in year 13. This would have him signed through his 15th NFL season. But really not much else of major investment on the defensive line. Carl Granderson is in a contract year, so definitely worth keeping an eye on that situation, because he could walk after this year and Isaiah Foskey could step into that role. Now looking at linebacker, Demario Davis signed for the next 2 years. Just $7 million this year, but increases to $18 next year. So could be a potential cut restructure candidate in 2024 as well. Definitely seems like the Saints are going to have a lot to figure out here in terms of restructuring these high cap hits. Then starter Zach Bond is in a contract year as well, so potentially need to address that. Then in the secondary, not really anything of note happening here. Most of these guys are locked up for the next couple seasons. Marshawn Lattimore getting the money he deserves. Tyrann Mathieu for the next 2 seasons, but seems like the Saints are at a pretty good spot, at least for right now. They might have a tough time re-signing some of the players that are in contract years this year, but there doesn't seem to be too many, and they definitely have the ability to restructure these deals to create more cap space. And if they end up making the playoffs this season as the division winner, I think they'll definitely be more willing to move some things around to keep this team competitive. Finally, we will look at the Saints' future draft pick situation, because there is a little bit going on here. They do have an additional second-round pick coming in from the Denver Broncos, although they do owe one to the Philadelphia Eagles as part of that 2022 trade. But then on the flip side, they gave a third-round pick to Denver this season, which Denver then traded to Seattle potentially. So 1 first-round pick, 1 second-round pick, 0 third-round picks for the New Orleans Saints. And then they actually even give up a 4th-rounder here too, so 0 third and 0 4th-round picks. So not a lot of cap space going forward, really not a lot of draft picks coming in. So what you see is kind of what you get with the Saints roster right now. And not a terrible place for them to be. I do have them projected with a 5-12 finish. Though I wouldn't be surprised if they finish somewhere closer to 8-9. But I don't really see them doing much better than that. And for a team that really seems all in right now, not the best place to be. So love to hear from the Who Dat Nation out there. Can the Saints win this NFC South? How do you feel about them going forward? Will they have to move on from some big names after this season? Or am I just overblowing that and they can easily just restructure a bunch of these deals and keep this thing rolling along? What about the defense? Do you think the defense is going to be able to maintain its top 10 status, or with all the shuffling going around on that defensive line, are they going to start to regress a little bit? And what about Derek Carr? How do you feel about him? Do you think he alone is going to be enough to turn around their fortunes for playoff success this season? So, love to hear from you guys down below, and we are on to the Big Apple in the next video. We'll go Giants first because G comes before J, but Giants and Jets, look forward to those two. Both should be very fun conversations to have. Look forward to talking to you guys then.